Welcome back, Dolphins. Today we're going to be talking about something that I think is underlyingly playing out. Again, there's going to be a lot of Debbie Downers for the Miami Dolphins, and I'm going to be the optimistic one, along with like Reason and sometimes Dougley can be optimistic, but I'm going to be the overly optimistic YouTuber. But one of the things that I really want to talk about is the Dolphins head coaching staff and where it's going to go and how I think it's actually the perfect spot that we're in. So obviously we have Mike McDaniel, and he is the head coach right now. There's some issues kind of going on with Mike McDaniel. I think we all know that, that whole goofy personality was cool when he first got here, but players need not a little kid to be leading them, but a man. And not saying that Mike McDaniel can't grow into that. It's a possibility. Sometimes it takes being molded by failure to make yourself into a man. Praise God. And honestly, one of the things that we have to talk about is the Dolphins have two head coaches on the staff. If you really think about this, Mike McDaniel is the head coach, 100%. But Anthony Weaver, the defense coordinator, is a head coach. He will be a head coach next year or after next year. And you have to understand this, that right now we're actually in a very good spot head coaching wise, where I think this is why Chris Greer did what he did this offseason and is kind of doing a small rebuild, because there's two things that can happen. Mike McDaniel shows up and, the team does well. We win a playoff game, blah, blah, blah. That's what it is. And Anthony Weaver goes and gets a head coaching job somewhere else. Or it isn't what we want. And, Mike McDaniel kind of screws things up. And then Anthony Weaver will then take over after we fire Mike McDaniel. Because right now what I'm hearing a lot is that Anthony Weaver kind of, people like him better, and it's, you can kind of honestly see it, that quirky Mike McDaniel mentality. If you were winning 12 win seasons, things were just on the up and up, wouldn't matter. Obviously winning cures everything, but it's that you're losing and you're not really, the Mike McDaniel train, you're not really like a, how do I say it? Like, you don't really have the personality of a head coach. You don't really have a guy that is like, we can stand behind that and be like, yeah, that's our head. Like, if we could be really honest as Dolphins fans, when Mike McDaniel is stuttering and, doing the goofy stuff, it kind of looks like, someone that has it. It doesn't look like a man. I mean, that sounds bad, but it doesn't look like a man. And Anthony Weaver, built, muscular, talks very slow, doesn't stutter, looks and enunciates his words, very professional. He sounds and acts like a man, and that's someone you can get behind as a football player and even as a Dolphins fan. And when we talk about this, we have to understand that we are actually in the perfect position, because I don't think it's going to be that, if Mike McDaniel comes out and wins 6 games straight right off the bat, we're 6-0 and we're just like rolling into the playoffs. Sure, great. We found something and we're good to go. But if he's like 3-3, by the bye week, or I forgot when our bye week is, but if we're like 500 by the bye week, I think he gets fired, because it's a different situation. You don't just have some random interim guy coming in. You have a dude that people are trying to hire him for a head coach. He's going to have a head coaching position after next year, so it's not really like an interim coach. It's just going to be, you're going to see what your head coach is going to be next year, because most likely, if this does occur, you're going to try and hire Anthony Weaver. What would be the better pick as a head coaching position? You have a guy that has transformed this defense. Our defense was pretty good with, small pickings last year. And I think a lot of these picks that are on this defense are going to play very well with Anthony Weaver. And you have a dude that, essentially when you take a look at this, when we look at Tua, I think Tua, I like Tua as a quarterback. I think he's a good quarterback. I think he just needs to stay healthy. I think what Mike McDaniel's done with Tua is kind of like, this is where he's going to be. He's a very accurate quarterback, and you just need to get him a better line, and he will perform as an accurate quarterback. He can be the franchise guy if he just stays healthy, stays in the pocket. You get him an offensive line. We can compete with these teams because he's very accurate, and he shows it. He shows that he's been doing it better and better, and the only time that anything actually ever happens is that we don't have an offensive line. He gets rushed, and things just turn to crap. So Tua can perform at a high level. I think he's gotten exactly where Mike McDaniel needed to get him. I don't think that Tua is just going to miraculously have like a more talented year or whatever. I think he's kind of gotten where he needs to get. And it's where he's gotten is a top 10 quarterback, and that's something that is more than sufficient to get into the playoffs. And I honestly think, people might hate me for this, but I think he's a better quarterback than Jalen Hurts. I think Jalen Hurts just has a lot more around him that make him look better. But I think, Tua is definitely a much more better quarterback, very accurate, and I think you can win with him. I think you have basically a Drew Brees on this team, so I think you're fine with that. So the thing is that you're fine with that, and if you watch my last video, I'll explain to you why I think Waddle's going to have a great year. The offense is fine. You can get an offensive coordinator and be okay if Mike McDaniel starts slipping, because as we all know, the defense is probably going to be good. The defense is probably going to be good coming into this season, and it's because of Anthony Weaver. So where we're at in what we're doing is that you have two head coaches, and it's basically a performance audit on both coaches. Who is going to be the head coach for 2026? Yeah, because it's 2025. Who's going to be the head coach on the Miami Dolphins? And I think Stephen Ross has set it up perfectly where who is going to be that. So that's why we've done this small rebuild, getting rid of the older players, because we're trying to build for whoever's going to be the coach next year, if it's going to be Mike McDaniel or if it's going to be Anthony Weaver. And again, like I'm saying, Mike McDaniel, he can definitely turn into a good head coach. I think a lot of people forget that when you get a head coaching job for the first time, you're kind of like a rookie in the NFL. You're learning as you go. Andy Reid didn't win a Super Bowl until like 20 years into his coaching career. In the Eagles, they kind of looked at him like kind of a gimmicky, great head coach, but he just couldn't get over the hump. There's a lot of coaches that took forever, even the 49ers coach. I know he's got him to Super Bowls, but a lot of people are out on him too. So this happens all the time. You can change, and I think Mike McDaniel can, but it's up to him to want to, and honestly, I think a lot of people are reading it. And like I said, if Mike McDaniel can do it, I'm all for keeping Mike McDaniel. And I think what's happening right now is he's trying to be more tough-nosed and not be so player-friendly. And I think people, that are fans of Miami, they want like immediate things, and it's a learning curve. And I think he's trying to understand that the approach that he came into head coaching, it doesn't necessarily work for him. He needs to change up, and that's what he's doing right now. It's probably why Jalen Ramsey wants to leave, because, it's a different style. Maybe people don't, this, that, and the other thing. They don't respect him, whatever it is. There's a time to learn and to develop a philosophy that you want. He's only 3 years into head coaching. That's not a lot of time to learn a lot of stuff. But again, you have Anthony Weaver there. So if Mike McDaniel can't put it together, if we can't come out, and all that really needs to happen for us to win, all that really needs to happen for Mike McDaniel to keep his job, is the offense perform at a top 10 level. That's it. It needs to perform at a top 10, top 8 level. If you can perform at that level, if you can score 28 points a game or somewhere around those lines, because there's no reason why you shouldn't. You have so many weapons. The offensive line's better. You have the same receivers. If not, we'll see what happens with Tyreek, but you have all the weapons that you need. You want to keep your job, perform a top 10 offense, and Weaver will make a top 10 defense, and this team will be, a legit playoff contender. I think people are skipping on that because, again, the head coaching thing that we have right now, you have two head coaches on the roster, two of them. There's a defensive head coach and an offense head coach, and that's kind of what people are underlyingly not seeing. So if this team doesn't perform offensively, because that's the only thing that I can really see happening. We have a lot of defensive players. I don't see this defense being bad. If this offense performs the way that it needs to perform, I think everything's all good. Anthony Weaver gets a head coaching job somewhere else next year, and we bring in someone else. But the offense starts to sputter. I definitely think Mike McDaniel goes, and we just hire Anthony Weaver, and we're good to go. So I think that's something that we have to think about. Like and subscribe if you like this video. Let me know down in the comments what you think, who you like better. Obviously, most people are going to say, oh, Anthony Weaver. I like Mike McDaniel. I think he could be a good head coach. I think if he gets together his philosophy offensively, I think if he puts the two offenses together that he had, where Tyreek Hill's going for 50 yards, Waddle's going for 50 yards, and also Waddle's going for 2 yards, and going for slants and going for easy passes, and I think if he puts them together, it can be a very, very good offense, especially if you start building the trenches, like we've done this draft. If you continue doing this in the draft, where, I think Mike McDaniel has learned from the Eagles' philosophy, if one of your first 2 picks is an offensive lineman, you're going to be good. If your picks are continually offensive and defensive linemen, you're going to be good. And I think he's learned that this offseason, and we'll see what happens. Fins up, baby. Love you all. Peace.